The National Hemophilia Foundation provides advocacy, support, education, and information to people living with bleeding disorders, inherited bleeding disorders. We are uber organized for a small disease group. And it has been that way since the inception of the organization. Patients with hemophilia had no treatment in the 1940s and 50s. Parents did blood drives, and when their kids had a bleeding episode, they would take those blood credits to the blood bank and their child would be infused with whole blood, and that would help control the bleeding episode. They banded together, started a national organization that became the National Hemophilia Foundation. Hemophilia affects mostly men, transferred from mom to males on the X chromosome. There are some girls with hemophilia, but very few. About a third of all of the cases of hemophilia are spontaneous mutation. Before treatment, it was a horrible disease with a life expectancy of about 20 years of age, crippling joints. Plasma therapies happened in the mid-60s. Clotting factor came along in the 70s. That's a fractionized version of pooled plasma. The miracle drug that allowed us freedom to go to school and have jobs and build our own families turned out to be a false savior, in that in the 80s we learned we were infected with HIV. You'll find in medical care that there is a risk-benefit to everything. From the pharmaceutical industry's point of view, the risk of viruses that they had never seen was lower than not providing the treatment. Now that doesn't mean they're good guys, and when they found out that there were viruses that they had never seen, they didn't stop producing the product. Here's the shocking news. We found that not only did they know, but then they took the product they could no longer sell to us and they shipped it other places. So yeah, they're a villain. All the people who were leaders in this community were also affected by HIV. Many people point to them and say they were guilty and neglectful. And I look back at those individuals. If they were willful in their actions, then they paid with their lives and the lives of their children. They didn't save themselves. They didn't escape HIV. I try to keep that in mind, and I try to teach our young people that. It was a failure all the way around. There were no winners in this for hemophilia. The government failed us. CDC tried, FDA failed us. The administration failed us, and we failed ourselves. My wife and I knew we were infected when we saw other people in the community dying. We had not had a test. It was an interesting time in California. There was a state senator called Lyndon LaRouche who had proposed quarantining all of the people who were HIV positive. My treatment center, in response to that, decided not to do an AIDS test on anybody, so it would not be in our medical files and couldn't be accessed by the state. My wife had a seizure in 1988 where she was unconscious, and I had to take her to the hospital. And over the next 4 years or so, she declined. She embraced her infection and began speaking as the only white woman from business America who had contracted AIDS. She made the story real, made it wider, spoke to a broader audience, and she was good at it. I often tell people that if Katie had lived, she would be the CEO of the National Hemophilia Foundation, not me. I survived till 1995 before I had to take a cocktail. I remember my nurse coming in to the exam room and saying, "Your T cells have dropped to like 65," and she was almost in tears. And I looked at her and I said, "You know, I feel great, I'm not gonna die. We'll just wait for the treatments." And they came, and I didn't die. There's something about getting on a cocktail, because once you take that step, you realize that you're taking those drugs forever. It's a sobering moment. The hemophilia community didn't want to be associated with AIDS. Other than Ryan White and the Ricky Ray family, I think it sent people into hiding. If their kid didn't profoundly look like that they had hemophilia or AIDS, they weren't telling anybody. The hemophilia community, I describe them, no matter where they live, is largely middle Americans. They live, in small communities. Their child is one among many that are not affected. A difficult place to be. And that's why the activism within the community was so important. You had to embrace that pain, you had to embrace that injustice, and you had to speak out. Ryan White was a boy from Indiana who had hemophilia, who contracted HIV, very much so decided that he would not be prevented from going to school. He became a hero to many Americans, but very much so to the hemophilia community, who, as I said earlier, was hiding. I think Ryan White spoke very candidly about his infection. I think that surprised people. I think people expected him to be apologetic for having AIDS, and he wasn't. It became folklore as the stars began to embrace him. Elton John and Michael Jackson and Elizabeth Taylor, and it gave us all so much hope. I think that inspired courage in a lot of people. It was the missing ingredient that allowed us to kind of get our own act together in terms of advocating for ourselves. Sometimes you just need to have a spark, and Ryan was that spark. The Ryan White Care Act is the Comprehensive AIDS Resources Emergency Act. It was the first time the government officially recognized AIDS. It established critical AIDS centers around the country that could address the psychosocial issues related to AIDS, HIV care, access to medication. The Ryan White Care Act provided no funding specifically for hemophilia. The Ricky Ray Hemophilia Relief Act was a payment to patients who have been affected by HIV in the hemophilia and bleeding disorders communities. The argument we made to Congress was that hemophilia is largely a male disease passed from mother to son on the X chromosome. So when these men died, they were the head of their household. They couldn't get life insurance anyway as a person with hemophilia. So when they died, their family really was financially impacted, not only then, but for generations, because whatever children they had that didn't have hemophilia no longer had a head of household that would try and help them pay for college or do all the things that parents do for their kids to kind of get them started. And in a Republican House and Congress, that sold.